The envelope was thin, but the words inside cut like a blade. Notice to vacate. William Carter stared at the page, his hands trembling. According to the county clerk, the house he had built over 40 years ago no longer belonged to him. The signature on the quitclaim deed looked exactly like his same tilt, the confident curl on the C, and the steady cross of the T. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he had never signed it. His eyes dropped to the line that confirmed his worst fear. The name, written as the grantee, the new owner of his home, was none other than his son David. And beside him, complicit in every stroke of ink, was David's wife, Melissa. Melissa's voice sliced through the silence. "It's legal, William. You signed. Maybe you don't remember, but the paper doesn't lie." Her smile carried no warmth, only victory. William felt his chest tighten, memories of his late wife Margaret echoing through the walls. This was their home, the ground where they planted every rosebush, the place she had asked him never to abandon. And now, in one forged signature, it was gone. He folded the notice, his knuckles whitening. This was no mistake. It was betrayal, stamped and notarized. If your own child forged your signature to steal your home, would you stay silent or fight back? The house still smelled faintly of roses, even though Margaret had been gone for years. William Carter tended to her garden every morning, trimming the bushes she once insisted would outlast them both. She had been right. The blooms kept coming season after season, even after her chair at the kitchen table sat empty. Neighbors often waved when he watered the yard. They remembered him from church picnics and town fairs. To them, he was the quiet carpenter who stayed faithful to his wife until the end. And to William, the house was more than shelter. It was his promise to Margaret. Never sell, never leave. She had whispered on her last night. He had sworn it. That morning, William sorted through the mail, an envelope from Social Security, another flyer about Medicare Advantage plans. He sighed. "They never stop reminding me I'm getting older," he muttered, tossing them aside. But one line on the Social Security letter made him pause. "If you suspect fraud, contact us immediately." He frowned, slipped it back into the pile, and shook his head. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Bills and notices piled up, yet none could shake his devotion to the home he had built with Margaret. He still walked slowly to St. Mary's on Sundays, the little church on the corner. Folks there always asked about Margaret's roses, and he'd smile, saying, "They bloom for her." After the service, over coffee in the fellowship hall, someone always clapped his shoulder. "You're still in that old place. William must be tough alone." He'd chuckle, though the words lingered like a bruise. Sometimes he stopped by the town library, where the same gray-haired clerk greeted him by name. He skimmed the headlines, shaking his head at stories of scams targeting seniors. "Tricked into signing away their homes," one article warned. He folded the paper quickly, heart pounding harder than he cared to admit. But at home, the warmth had thinned. His son David visited less often, always rushing between shifts and excuses. When he did come, Melissa spoke more than he did. She asked about insurance policies, bank statements, even the deed. William would wave her off, joking, "You worry too much, girl. This house isn't going anywhere." Her smile never reached her eyes. One afternoon, as William polished the porch railing, he noticed something unusual. Across the yard near David's car, Melissa stood close to a man in a pressed shirt, a notary stamp glinting in his hand. They whispered quickly, glancing toward the house. A stack of papers exchanged hands. When Melissa saw William watching, she startled, tucking the sheets behind her back. "Just insurance forms," she called with a laugh, though her voice trembled. The notary slipped into his car and drove away. William's stomach turned. Insurance. Why hide it then? He wanted to press her, but David hurried out, changing the subject, pulling Melissa toward the car. They left William standing on the porch, his knuckles white against the wood. He shook his head, convincing himself he was just being suspicious. Yet the image of the notary seal gleaming in the sun clung to him like a warning. Days passed, but the unease grew. Melissa began dropping comments that felt like barbs. "This place is too much for you to handle alone, William. Maybe it's time to think about alternatives." She spoke as if she were doing him a favor. David stayed quiet, eyes lowered. At night, William walked the hallways, brushing his fingers along the photographs. His wedding portrait, Margaret's smile framed in lace, David as a boy holding a kite. Holidays where the table overflowed with food and laughter. Now, silence echoed through those same rooms, heavier than the creak of the floorboards. Papers seemed to appear on counters and coffee tables, hospital brochures, retirement community pamphlets. William never asked for them. Melissa always shrugged, just information, Dad. But each folded sheet felt like a nail hammered into the coffin of his independence. One evening, he caught Melissa whispering on the phone in the kitchen. The word, deed, drifted through the air before she noticed him and snapped the call short. Telemarketers, she claimed, her grin brittle. William pretended to believe her, but inside his chest, dread was growing roots. He sat by the window that night, rain streaking the glass, the roses shivering in the storm. He whispered to the dark, "Margaret, am I imagining things? Or are they truly circling this house like vultures?" The silence offered no answer. Only the steady drip of water and the memory of his wife's last plea. Never sell, never leave. William pressed his palm flat against the wall. He could feel the heartbeat of the home, steady, strong, refusing to die. But he also felt something else, the shadow of betrayal, tightening around him, unseen but undeniable. William sat alone in the living room after David and Melissa had left, the sound of their car fading into the distance. The silence of the house pressed in on him like an old coat that no longer fit but still carried the scent of years gone by. The binder Melissa had waved in his face still rested on the coffee table, sharp-edged and accusing. He didn't reach for it yet. Instead, he let his eyes wander across the mantel where photographs stood in a row like quiet jurors. Each picture told a story. David as a toddler with cake smeared across his cheeks, Margaret laughing in the garden, her hair catching the sun. A family Christmas in the 70s, wrapping paper piled high, the tree leaning a little to the left. William had built that tree stand himself out of scrap wood. It had lasted longer than he expected, just like the marriage it presided over. The house had never been perfect, but it had been theirs. William remembered when he and Margaret first walked through the door as a young couple. The wallpaper peeled, the plumbing groaned, and the roof leaked in 3 places. But Margaret had looked past the flaws and said, "I can see us here, Will. I can see a family." That vision became the anchor of his life. He worked double shifts at the steel mill, saved every penny, and spent his weekends hammering, sanding, and painting. Margaret chose color-stitched curtains and filled the kitchen with the smell of cinnamon bread. They raised David here, marking his growth on the pantry doorframe in pencil notches that climbed year after year. William remembered steadying the bicycle as David wobbled down the driveway, running beside him until he found his balance. He remembered teaching him to swing a bat in the backyard, Margaret cheering from the porch with a glass of iced tea in her hand. Those were the golden years filled with small triumphs that felt enormous at the time. But life was never only golden. The steel mill took its toll on William's body. His back ached. His hands developed calluses deep as scars, and nights were short because overtime was long. He carried the burden without complaint because each paycheck meant the mortgage was paid and the house remained secure. Margaret would rub his shoulders at the kitchen table and remind him why it mattered. "This isn't just a house," she said. "It's a promise we're keeping every day." The hardest promise came years later when Margaret's health failed. Illness crept in slowly then, all at once. William became her caregiver, learning to measure medicine, prepare special meals, and keep the house spotless so she would feel dignity even in weakness. In those quiet nights sitting beside her bed, she had asked him for one last vow. "Promise me you'll keep the house, Will. Promise me it will always be here for David." William had squeezed her frail hand and said yes, even as his heart broke, knowing she might not live to see it. After she passed, the house felt emptier, but also more sacred. Every corner carried her presence, the roses she had planted in the yard, the worn spot on the couch where she liked to read, the floral apron still hanging in the pantry. William grieved, but he also kept busy. He fixed the porch rail, replaced the roof, and kept the roses blooming each spring. Caring for the house became his way of caring for her memory. David came home from the funeral, hollow-eyed and distracted. William tried not to take it personally. Grief affects everyone differently. but over time, distance grew between them. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent. David pursued his career, married Melissa, and built a life that seemed increasingly separate from the house that had raised him. William wanted to believe the bond was still there, hidden under the surface, but doubts crept in like water through cracked shingles. Still, William supported him as best he could. He helped with tuition, dipped into savings for David's first car, even offered money when David and Melissa struggled to buy their own home. Each sacrifice felt justified because it was for his son's future. Margaret would have approved, he thought. Fathers give, children grow. That was the natural order. Yet there were moments when Melissa's words pricked like thorns. She spoke of the house as if it were a burden, not a legacy. She urged William to downsize, to consider selling while the market was high. David rarely contradicted her, his silence louder than agreement. William told himself not to worry. They were young, practical, focused on building their own life. They didn't understand yet what it meant to anchor a family in one place. But the notice to vacate proved that the misunderstanding had turned into betrayal. It forced William to confront not just the present conflict, but the long road that had led there. Every sacrifice, every hour of labor, every promise whispered to Margaret weighed against the cold legal language of eviction. 30 days to leave, 30 days to abandon half a century of devotion. William rose from his chair and paced the living room, touching the frames as he passed. His hand lingered on Margaret's smile, on David's childhood grin. He whispered to the empty air, "I kept my promise, Margaret. I kept it all these years. I won't stop now." He opened a drawer and pulled out his old journals, worn notebooks where he had recorded repairs expenses and milestones, receipts for shingles, lumber, and paint, notes about when he planted the roses, when he replaced the furnace, when he patched the driveway. Each line was proof that the house was not just a property but a life maintained. He stacked the journals on the table beside Melissa's binder. Two versions of truth sat side by side, one built on ink and love, the other on legal maneuvering. William knew which one would endure. William woke early the next morning, long before the sun crept over the horizon. The house groaned around him, as it always had, a familiar chorus of settling wood and aging pipes. Yet today the sounds carried a heavier meaning, as though the very bones of the house feared being abandoned. He shuffled to the kitchen, brewed coffee, and stood at the window, watching the roses bow under a thin veil of dew. Margaret had planted them, and he had kept them alive. Each bloom was a testimony. As he sipped, William's eyes wandered to the pantry doorframe etched with David's growth marks. Each line carried a date and his careful handwriting. Age 6, age 7. He remembered how David had beamed when the pencil scratched higher than the year before. William had always marked the line with pride, promising his son that one day he would be taller than his father. That day had come and gone, but the notches remained frozen reminders of promises kept. He drifted through the house, touching E. In the evening, William walked the perimeter of the yard. The fence leaned in places, but it still stood guard. He paused by the tool shed, recalling afternoons when he and David fixed bikes or sanded old boards together. The shed smelled of sawdust and oil, familiar and grounding. He whispered aloud, "If walls could testify, you'd clear my name in an instant." Later, he opened the binder Melissa had left. He studied the false signature again, tracing its smooth curves with a trembling finger. It was When the clock struck midnight, William closed the notebook and whispered into the silence, "I kept my word, Margaret, and I will keep it still." The house answered in its own way, a creak in the rafters, the whisper of wind against the roses, the steady pulse of a home that had endured storms before and would endure again. William woke before dawn, the house resting in layers of shadow. He lay still and listened to the creak of timbers, the sigh of the vents, the faint tick of a pipe. Those sounds had always been companions, but today they felt like witnesses waiting to be called. On the living room table, the binder lay where Melissa had left it, its slick cover catching a pale stripe of window light. He didn't open it. He had already seen the signature that pretended to be his. At 9 o'clock, sharp gravel crackled in the drive. William rose, buttoned his shirt, and opened the door before the first knock. David stepped out of his car, smoothing the front of his tie, eyes red from a night that had not included sleep. Melissa followed, heels biting the concrete, the binder clutched close as if it were proof of virtue. "Come in," William said. "Coffee is ready." In the kitchen, 3 mugs steamed on the table. Sunlight fell in hard, clean lines across the wood. Without the papers, it could have been an ordinary morning. Melissa set the binder down and opened it with the neat confidence of a person who loves the feel of stamped pages. "We should be efficient, William." The recorder processed the transfer. "David is owner of record. We need a timetable and we need to coordinate movers." William looked at his son, not at the papers. "Is that true?" David's jaw worked. "That is what the clerk said." He kept his eyes on a coffee ring instead of on his father. "Your name is crossed out. Mine is listed." "And how did that happen?" William asked. Melissa answered as if responding to a deposition. "You granted durable authority. The statutes are clear. Assisted living is in your best interest. Safer environment, staff on call, no maintenance burden. This house is a hazard." "This house is my life," William said. "I built it with your mother." Melissa fanned more pages across the table. Title history, deed copy, notary acknowledgement, witness statement, all proper. She tapped the signature line. "Your name notarized." William tipped his head and studied the curves of the letters. He knew the tremor of his hand, the drag where the pen always caught on the loop of the W, the little rise at the end of the M that appeared when he was tired. The line on the page was smooth and proud and foreign. "A good imitation," he said. "Not my hand." "Denial does not change public record," Melissa replied. "Cooperation will help you transition with dignity." A knock at the back door startled the air. Mrs. Johnson stood there with a wicker basket and her careful smile. "I overbaked," she said. "Muffins again." Her gaze slipped to the papers, then to William's face. "Did I come at a bad time?" "You came at a neighbor's time," William said, and took the basket. The blueberries were still warm. "Thank you. If you need anything," she said, placing more weight on the word than normal, "I am right next door." "We are fine," Melissa answered quickly. "Just paperwork." Mrs. Johnson's eyes paused a fraction too long on the notary stamp. Then she nodded and stepped back. William watched the screen door ease shut behind her. The house exhaled with the faint rattle of old springs. Melissa gathered the papers again. "We should keep to the agenda." William turned to David. "Your mother's roses need pruning," he said. "Cut above the node so the plant heals stronger. She showed you that." David's voice was small. "I remember." "Then remember this," William said. "Truth cut clean helps things live." Melissa snapped the binder closed. "We are not here for botanical metaphors. We are here because you cannot manage this place alone." A piece of laundry waited in a basket by the back steps. William lifted it and started down the stairs. His heel slid on a loose tread, and he lurched forward, catching the rail with his palm. Socks scattered. Pain flashed sharp and brief. Melissa's breath caught and then sharpened into opportunity. "Exactly what I have been saying. One fall and you break a hip. You need to move before something worse happens." William steadied himself, gathered one of the socks and looked at her. "The danger is not the stair." He turned to David. "Walk with me." They stepped into the garden. The wind carried the smell of damp soil and petals. William touched the trellis he had built from scrap lumber, then faced his son. "When you were 7, you broke the kitchen window with a line drive," he said. "You hid in the closet. Your mother brought hot chocolate, and I asked one question. Did you hit the ball?" David nodded without raising his eyes. "I said yes. We fixed the window together," William said. "That is family. Honesty first, then repair. So I ask you now, did I sign that deed?" David's lips parted. He closed them, throat-working. The breeze ruffled his tie. Silence answered. Melissa's voice came from the doorway. "Enough. We have a schedule." William kept his gaze on his son. "You have a schedule," he said, "and I have a vow." He laid his palm flat on the trellis. "I promised your mother this house would stand until my last day." Back inside, he lifted the phone and dialed the county recorder. He spoke each syllable clearly, like nails driven straight. "This is William H. Carter. I need to verify a deed transfer on parcel 44729B and file a sworn statement disputing the signature." Keys clicked. Paper shuffled somewhere miles away. "Transfer recorded 3 weeks ago," the clerk said. "From William H. Carter to David Carter. Witness J.K. Hanley. Notary L.M. Brewster. Mobile notarization at an address on Maple Street." "That is not my signature," William said. "What is the process? To contest, you may submit a notarized affidavit with signature samples," the clerk replied. She paused, and William heard caution in the pause. If there is evidence of fraud, the deed can be flagged pending investigation. Email me the forms, William said. Melissa's mouth tightened. Even if you file, possession can proceed. We can move you while the flag is pending. Not if the sheriff reads the same book you do. William said, covering the receiver with his hand. Into the phone he added, "Thank you," then repeated his email and wrote down the instructions. When he hung up, the room felt different, the way a room changes when someone opens a window. He imagined Margaret's voice the way it sometimes came to him near the sink where she used to hum hymns. "Stand firm, Will. The house will hold if you do." That afternoon, Pastor James arrived with a thermos of coffee and 2 congregants who had known William since his hair was dark. They did not bring pity. They brought attention. William set his journals on the table, years of dates and costs, notes about shingles and furnaces and nails, grocery lists written in his hand and in Margaret's. He showed them his signature from old church ledgers and compared it to the one on the deed copy. Pastor James studied the loop of the W. "You curl this stroke every time," he said. "This one does not curl." Mrs. Ellis traced the M with her finger hovering above the paper. "You always lift here." Whoever wrote this never lifted. Melissa stood across the room with her arms crossed, guarding distance. "Character impressions are not the law," she said. "Experts decide handwriting." "And experts, we will ask," William replied. "Truth is not afraid of more light." The next morning, the clerk called back sooner than William expected. "Mr. Carter, your affidavit can be filed today. Bring identification and as many signature samples as you have. We will flag the deed while it is reviewed." Flagged. William repeated. The word felt like weight settling in the right place. "I will come this morning." After the call, Melissa stared out the window at the street as if it had betrayed her. "We are not pausing because a clerk put a sticker on a file," she said. "David, call the movers." David looked at the signature again as if it might confess. "Maybe we should slow down," he said. "We talked about this." Melissa snapped. "The debts do not slow down. Reality does not slow down. There is a difference between pressure and perjury," David answered. He sounded tired rather than brave, but the line still held. William slid the forms into a folder and took his coat. He did not ask if anyone would come with him. He walked past the roses and breathed their stubborn sweetness. "Stand firm." At the courthouse, fluorescent lights hummed and the floor wax smelled like the high school gym where he used to watch David play. A notary compared deeds, examined signatures on marriage certificates and tax receipts and church ledgers, and then looked at the deed copy. "These are consistent," she said, tapping the real ones. "This is not." She stamped his affidavit and handed him a copy that still felt warm from the press. When he stepped into the sunlight, he saw David across the street leaning against a lamppost with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. David crossed without looking both ways like a boy again. "I followed you," David said. "I did not know if you would need a ride." "I have legs," William said and tried a smile. It stayed. They walked to the car together. On the drive, David drummed his fingers on the wheel. "Melissa says the system is slow," he said. "She says if we control the move, we control the story." "What do you think?" William asked. David stared at the road. "I think I'm tired of controlling anything." When they pulled into the drive, Melissa was already on the porch phone in her hand like a baton. "Did the bureaucracy bless your tantrum?" she said. "The deed is flagged," William replied. "Investigation opened." Melissa laughed without mirth. "Flagged is not voided. We proceed." "You proceed alone," David said. The sentence surprised him as much as it did her. "We are not moving him while there is an investigation." Melissa blinked as if a light somewhere had flickered. "Excuse me, I said no," David repeated. "If it is fraud, we undo it. If it is not, we talk, but we do not pretend." "So you choose him," Melissa said. "Understand what that costs." The following day, the sheriff's office returned William's call. An officer confirmed they would not enforce a move-out while a fraud flag was active. Pastor James drafted a brief statement about William's handwriting. Mrs. Johnson came by with a memory the week the deed was dated. She had seen a mobile notary's car idling by the curb and had heard Melissa on the phone saying something about handling things because he would not understand. She could not swear to the exact words, but the shape of the moment was clear. She would testify if asked. As evening settled, no doors slammed. The house stood a little straighter as if waiting for the law to speak. That night, when the house had gone quiet again, William sat in his chair by the window and let the silence wrap around him. The binder was gone from the table. Melissa had taken it, but the imprint of its weight remained, as if the wood itself remembered the insult. He folded his hands and stared at the faint reflection of his own face in the glass. The fight had begun. The county had flagged the deed, an investigation would come, and Melissa was already planning her next move. Yet what echoed most in William's chest was not anger, but an ache that lived deeper. Betrayal always cut hardest when it wore the face of family. He let his eyes wander through the living room. Every corner carried a memory: the scuff mark on the baseboard from David's first bicycle crash, the dent in the mantel from Margaret's laughter when she dropped the picture frame, the faded curtains she had sewn herself in the summer of '89. Each detail was proof of a life lived, of love poured into wood and plaster. How could anyone call this place a burden? William closed his eyes and spoke softly into the quiet. "Margaret, are you listening?" He knew the answer, and yet asked anyway, as if the house itself might answer for her. "They think I am weak. They think paper can erase what we built." His chest tightened and he pressed his palm against the armrest. "But I will not let them. Not while I still breathe." In the hush, he thought he heard her hum that low tune she always carried when tending the roses. It was not really there, he knew, but memory was a strange thing. It borrowed sound and gave it back when needed most. William leaned forward and opened one of his journals. The handwriting across the page was jagged, uneven, unmistakably his. He traced the strokes with his finger and whispered, "Here I am. This is me." He felt steadier for seeing it. The house creaked in the wind, the old timbers shifting the way they had for decades. To anyone else, it was just noise. To William, it was a promise. The home was still alive, and like him, it intended to endure. Yet beneath the determination lingered a question he could not shake. Was silence strength, or was it surrender? Had his years of swallowing words given Melissa the courage to believe she could silence him forever? He had always been the man who avoided fights, who carried burdens without complaint. Perhaps that very restraint had opened the door to this betrayal. He rubbed his temples and asked the empty room, "If you stay quiet too long, do you teach others to take more than they should? Or is patience its own power, one that only reveals itself when finally broken?" And then in the hush, he almost heard Margaret's voice, soft, certain a memory sharper than the rain. "You promised me, William. This house is not just wood and stone, it is us. Stand firm. Do not let them take what we built." He closed his eyes, lips trembling. "I remember, Margaret. I will not break that promise." He rubbed his temples and asked the empty room, "If you stay quiet too long, do you teach others to take more than they should? Or is patience its own power, one that only reveals itself when finally broken?" And then in the hush, he almost heard Margaret's voice, soft, certain a memory sharper than the rain. "You promised me, William. This house is not just wood and stone, it is us. Stand firm. Do not let them take what we built." He closed his eyes, lips trembling. "I remember, Margaret. I will not break that promise." In your own family, have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace? Did it protect you or cost you more than you ever imagined? Share your story in the comments below. He closed his eyes, lips trembling. "I remember, Margaret. I will not break that promise. Or is patience its own power, one that only reveals itself when finally broken?" For a moment he imagined his viewers, the neighbors, the pastor, even strangers beyond Cedar Falls who might one day hear this story. He wanted to ask them, to ask anyone willing to listen. What do you think, is silence strength, or is it weakness? The thought lingered like incense in the air. He breathed it in, letting the question settle deep inside him. William rose and walked slowly through the house. In the kitchen, he brushed a hand across the worn counter where Margaret had rolled out pie crusts. In the hallway, he touched the frame of David's old room, still marked with pencil lines recording each year of his growth. Upstairs, he opened the closet and found Margaret's scarf folded neatly, carrying the faintest trace of lavender. He held it to his face, inhaled, and whispered, "You gave me a life worth defending. I won't let it be stolen." Back downstairs, he returned to his chair. The house seemed to breathe with him, timbers settling as though leaning closer. He no longer felt completely alone. For all that Melissa schemed and David wavered, there were still voices, neighbors, friends, the law itself that would stand beside him. And there was Margaret, if only in memory, steadying his hands when they shook. The storm outside had eased into drizzle drops ticking steadily against the window. William stared into the gray sky and found his resolve settling like stone. He was tired, yes, but the kind of tired that meant he had given all he could to something worthy. The fight ahead would be hard, but at least it was honest. He closed the journal, set it firmly on the table, and whispered, "Tomorrow we move forward." The words were not loud, but in that moment they carried the weight of an oath. William woke before dawn, the determination in his chest steadier than the cold ache in his bones. For weeks he had been on the defensive, reacting, absorbing blows, watching the family he built fracture under deceit. But now the tide had shifted. The county clerk had already flagged the forged deed. Fraud was no longer just his suspicion, it was a word spoken by authority. For the first time in months, William felt the ground beneath his feet begin to firm. He brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, spreading his journals, receipts, and photographs across the surface. Evidence, he thought, not just of ownership, but of stewardship. The house was not an asset on a spreadsheet. It was a lifetime preserved in ink and sweat. He packed the documents into a weathered leather satchel that Margaret had given him years ago when David left for college. She had said, "One day you'll carry something important in this." That day had come. By 8 o'clock, William stood before the county courthouse. Its stone columns loomed above him, both intimidating and reassuring. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed and clerks shuffled papers. When he reached the front desk, he introduced himself. "William H. Carter. I need to file a sworn statement of fraud regarding a deed transfer." The clerk led him to a private office where a notary sat with a stack of forms. William laid out his evidence, the journals, the old deed, the receipts, even Margaret's handwritten notes. He pointed to his authentic signatures, shaky in places but consistent across decades. He showed the forged one, smooth and foreign. The notary compared them closely, eyebrows rising. "This warrants investigation," she said, stamping his affidavit. "Your statement will be sent to the recorder's office and to the district attorney. You'll be contacted for further testimony." As William signed the affidavit, his hand trembled not from fear, but from the gravity of reclaiming his truth. When the notary returned the document to him, she added softly, "Mr. Carter, don't lose heart. Fraud may be clever, but it cannot withstand the light for long." Outside the courthouse, William breathed in the crisp air. He felt taller, steadier. Margaret's voice seemed to echo through the breeze. "Stand firm, Will. The house will hold if you do." That evening he met with Pastor James and an old friend named Robert, a retired attorney from the congregation. They gathered in the fellowship hall, the scent of coffee and hymnals lingering in the air. William laid out his papers once again. Robert adjusted his glasses. "This is clear forgery. The county clerk's flag ensures no further transactions can proceed until the investigation concludes. That buys you time. More importantly, if fraud is proven, the deed is void. You remain the lawful owner." "And if they push possession?" William asked. Robert leaned back. "Possession isn't ownership. If they try to force you out before the investigation is complete, that itself is unlawful. You'd have the sheriff at your side." William nodded slowly, the weight on his chest easing. "So the truth has ground to stand on. The truth always does," Pastor James said. "But sometimes it needs someone willing to carry it to the gate." Meanwhile, David sat in his car outside the courthouse, hands gripping the steering wheel. He had followed his father without being seen, torn between guilt and fear. He watched William emerge with the affidavit in hand, his posture proud, David's chest constricted. He knew Melissa would see this as a declaration of war, yet part of him felt relief. His father was not crumbling, he was fighting, and deep down, David admired that. That night, David confessed to Melissa. He filed an affidavit. "Fraud investigation is underway." Melissa's face drained, then hardened. "He's bluffing. The system is slow. By the time they act, we'll have possession locked." "It's not a bluff," David said quietly. "He has journals, receipts, witnesses. He has the pastor. He even has Robert." Melissa slammed a glass on the counter, shattering it. "Then we'll fight harder. We'll claim he's incompetent, unfit to manage property. We'll bring doctor's papers, whatever it takes." David's stomach churned. The line between desperation and cruelty had blurred too far. He's my father, Melissa, and this house is our future, she snapped. If you can't stand with me, then step aside. David said nothing, but inside something cracked. The next day, William returned to the courthouse for a follow-up. This time, a supervisor from the recorder's office met him personally. Mr. Carter, we compared the signatures. The discrepancies are obvious. We've referred this to the district attorney for investigation. In the meantime, you remain the owner of record. Your son's claim is suspended. William felt his knees weaken, but he stood tall. This was the moment Margaret had prepared him for the turning point where truth pierced through lies. As he walked out, he spotted David waiting by the steps. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, David descended the steps. Dad, he said quietly, is it true? Did they say the deed is invalid? They said the truth is clear, William replied. Fraud cannot hold. David looked down, shame tightening his face. I let it happen. I let her. William raised a hand. You still have a choice. Stand with me. Stand with what's right. David's eyes glistened. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You don't have to be strong alone, William said. Just honest. David stood on the courthouse steps long after his father had gone, staring at the stone columns as if they might collapse under the weight of his choices. His phone buzzed with a message from Melissa Sharp, words demanding loyalty, pressing him to act quickly before the investigation consumed them. He slipped the phone back into his pocket without replying. For the first time in years, silence felt more honest than obedience. At home that evening, Melissa's fury boiled over. You let him get the clerk involved. Do you realize what that means? Once the district attorney touches this, we lose everything? David rubbed his face weary. We don't have to lose everything. We can step back, admit the mistake, and let things settle. Melissa slammed her palm on the counter. Step back. That old man will drag us through the mud. Do you want to watch our finances collapse, watch the creditors devour us? David's voice was low but firm. I'd rather face creditors than betray my father again. Melissa froze, her eyes narrowing. So that's it. You're switching sides. I'm choosing truth, David said. And maybe it's late, but it's not too late. Melissa's lips curled. Truth doesn't pay bills, David. Do you think the county will forgive debt because you had a change of heart? No. We fight until he breaks. But even as she spoke, her confidence wavered. David could see at the cracks in her armor the fear behind her defiance. The next morning, William met Robert, the retired attorney, in his living room. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, illuminating stacks of papers neatly arranged on the coffee table. You've done well documenting everything, Robert said. The journals, the receipts, the witnesses, they create a strong case. And now that the recorder's office flagged the deed, the law is on your side, but we can strengthen it further. How? William asked. Handwriting analysis, Robert replied. Independent experts can confirm the forgery. Once we have that, Melissa's claims will unravel. William nodded. Do it, whatever it takes. Robert leaned closer. William, this isn't just about legalities. It's about sending a message. Forgery is a crime. If the DA pursues charges, Melissa may face consequences far beyond losing a house. William's jaw tightened. So be it. Let the truth decide. That week became a blur of action. William visited the sheriff's office where deputies assured him they would enforce the stay of possession. He met with the handwriting analyst who compared signatures with a magnifying glass and declared them undeniably forged. He spoke to church friends who offered to testify about his character, his steady presence, his long history of careful stewardship. Each step strengthened his resolve. Each signature, each statement was a brick in the wall, protecting the promise he had made to Margaret. At night, William sat by the roses, breathing in their fragrance. He whispered into the cool air, We're building this case, Margaret, stone by stone. They won't take this from us. David, meanwhile, wrestled with his conscience. He drove past the house more than once, parking down the block so Melissa wouldn't know. From the car, he watched his father carry boxes of documents, greet neighbors, and water the roses with slow, deliberate care. It struck David how small the man looked, how frail in body yet unyielding in spirit. Shame gnawed at him, but also a strange pride. His father was fighting with dignity, and David began to see what Melissa never could. The house was not just property, it was legacy. One evening, unable to resist, he approached. William was on the porch mending a loose board. "Need a hand?" David asked quietly. William looked up, surprise flickering across his face. For a moment, neither moved. Then William handed him the hammer. Together they worked in silence. The board settled firm under their combined effort. When it was done, William said, "That's how it's always been, son. 2 hands. One purpose." David swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can fix everything. You can start with this," William replied, placing the hammer in his hand. "One nail at a time." The following week brought a decisive moment. William received a formal letter from the district attorney's office. The deed was declared fraudulent and null. Ownership of the property legally remained with him. A criminal investigation into the forgery was underway. William read the letter twice, his hands trembling. Relief flooded him, but also sorrow. This was never the victory he wanted. He would rather have his family whole than win a legal battle. Still, Margaret's voice echoed, "Stand firm." He called Robert, who confirmed the significance. "This is it, William. You've won the battle for the house. Now comes the battle for hearts." Melissa refused to concede. She appeared at the house 2 days later, fury etched on her face. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'll appeal. I'll drag this through every court if I have to." William faced her calmly. "The courts deal in truth, Melissa, and the truth has spoken." David stepped out from behind his father. His voice shook, but he stood tall. "I won't fight him anymore. Not for you, not for this." Melissa's eyes blazed. "You coward. You'll regret this." She stormed off her heels, striking the pavement like gunfire. When she was gone, David turned to William. "I don't deserve forgiveness." William's gaze softened. "Forgiveness isn't earned, it's given, and it starts when you choose honesty." That night, William wrote in his journal, "The house stands. The promise holds. My son is finding his way back." The roses swayed in the moonlight as if bowing to the truth. The rain eased to a drizzle, tapping lightly against the windows as William stood in the hallway listening to the gutters sing. He had built those gutters with his own hands the summer David turned 10. Now every drop of water felt like proof that his work still held, just as he intended to hold against the storm threatening his home. The phone call from the recorder's office still echoed in his ears. The deed was flagged. The case referred to the district attorney. It wasn't victory yet, only the first crack in the wall Melissa had built with lies. But it was enough. Enough to remind him that the law was not blind, that truth had a voice. He walked slowly through the house, touching the walls, the door frames, the banister where he had caught himself just days before. Each surface carried memory. Margaret's laughter. David's childhood. The smell of Sunday roasts drifting from the kitchen. To strangers, it was lumber and plaster. To William, it was a life, and no forgery could take that away without a fight. From the porch, he looked out over the roses, raindrops clinging to their petals like tears that refused to fall. He whispered, "We're still standing, Margaret." The roses swayed in the wind as if answering back. Behind him, the house settled, its timbers groaning in quiet solidarity. For the first time in weeks, William did not feel alone. Neighbors had noticed. The pastor had come. Even David had begun to waver. And Margaret, though gone, was with him still. Yet he knew the real battle was just beginning. Melissa would not stop. The debts were real, and her desperation would only sharpen. The district attorney's questions would be hard, the process slow. And families could fracture beyond repair once lawyers stepped in. The thought weighed heavy, but William's resolve held firmer than ever. He shut the door and returned to his chair by the window. The rain had faded into mist. The house was quiet again, but no longer silent. It breathed with him. It believed with him. He whispered into the empty room, "They think this is the end. They don't know it's only the beginning." For a long moment nothing stirred, only the slow tick of the clock measuring out the time until the next strike. William sat, tall hands resting on the journal Margaret had once touched, waiting for whatever came next. 2 days later, an official envelope arrived addressed to Melissa. The bold black letters on the front read, "Subpoena, appear before district court." Melissa's face blanched. "This means nothing," she snapped, though her hands trembled as she shoved the paper into her purse. William stood taller than he had in years. "It means the law wants your voice under oath, and lies sound different in court." For a moment the entire house seemed to exhale. The fight was far from over, but now the battlefield had shifted. William's eyes drifted to the window. Outside, Margaret's roses swayed gently in the wind, blooming as if defying time itself. He whispered, "Margaret, the house still stands, and so do I." If your own family betrayed you with forged signatures and fake medical reports, would you stay silent or fight with everything you had? Justice takes time, and William's battle has only just begun. The next chapter will decide everything, so make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching.